Under the white glare of early 2000s runway lights, a figure cuts through the room like a warning flare. Buzzed hair, steel piercings, a stare that refuses to blink. She doesn't walk, she advances, shoulders squared, hips unbothered, a swagger that reads more punk musician than mannequin. Editors whisper a single name, Omahyra. Casting directors call it new. The front row calls it too much. And fashion itself, so fluent in reinvention, suddenly looks uncomfortable in its own language. For a brief, blinding moment, she is the shock therapy an industry didn't know it needed. Androgynous, uncompromising, impossible to file away. Then, as the world slowly learns the vocabulary she wrote, the author vanishes from the sentence. How did fashion embrace her when it needed a rupture, then erase her when rupture became a trend? And what does it cost to be the future years before the future arrives? She wasn't born into the glamour of Paris or the gloss of New York. Omahyra Mota first opened her eyes in Santo Domingo, the Dominican Republic, a place of humid air, vibrant color, and sharp divisions between the privileged and the invisible. Her family was neither rich nor famous. They were simply trying to survive. When she was 10, her mother brought the children to New York, chasing stability in a city that could be merciless to newcomers. In Washington Heights, Omahyra grew into herself as an outsider. While other girls were taught to tame their curls, soften their voices, and dream of beauty contests, she carved her own rules. She shaved her head. She pierced her face. She wore her older brother's oversized clothes. She looked nothing like the polished models on glossy covers, and she didn't care. At 16, a chance encounter changed everything. A scout spotted her unconventional look on the streets of Manhattan. Where others saw a teenage rebel, he saw a face that could fracture fashion's carefully drawn lines. Omahyra wasn't the girl who had practiced runway walks in her bedroom mirror. She was the girl who walked down the block like she owned it, chin raised, daring the world to blink first. That raw defiance was her entry ticket into an industry that at the time had no idea how to categorize her. And it was precisely this refusal to fit that made her unforgettable. When Omahyra Mota stepped into the orbit of high fashion, she didn't glide in with the polished sheen of a supermodel hopeful. She stormed in, raw, unapologetic, and unwilling to conform. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, the fashion world was still clinging to its obsession with perfection, sculpted cheekbones, glossy hair, and a feminine softness that sold perfume and couture gowns. Omahyra was the antithesis of it all. She was the shock the runway didn't know it needed. Her rise began when Jean Paul Gaultier, a designer infamous for celebrating the unorthodox, saw her not as a risk, but as a revelation. On his runway, Omahyra's shaved head, piercing studded face, and defiant body language weren't flaws. They were the very essence of his aesthetic. She became one of his muses, walking in shows that felt more like declarations of war against the stale beauty codes of Paris. When Omahyra walked, audiences were not invited to admire her. They were forced to confront her. From there, the momentum was unstoppable. She became a fixture in the orbits of houses like Givenchy, Moschino, and Fendi. Editors who once questioned her marketability now fought for her in their pages. Vogue featured her. ID magazine, long a platform for subversion, made her a cover star. Even Playboy, typically a shrine to hyper-feminine fantasy, photographed her not as an object of male gaze, but as a walking contradiction, mixing cuffness with sensuality in a way that unsettled and fascinated at once. What set Omahyra apart wasn't just her look, it was her presence. On the runway, she didn't deliver the graceful glide of a Giselle or the icy poise of a Linda. She swaggered, she dared, She embodied a kind of gender-fluid energy long before the industry had language for it. In a world that demanded women shrink themselves into boxes of femininity, Omahyra exploded the box entirely. Critics began calling her the face of androgynous beauty, but the term felt too tidy, too contained for someone who existed to spill over boundaries. She wasn't dressing up as masculine or feminine. She was both and neither simultaneously. For the young queer kids watching fashion from the sidelines, Omahyra wasn't just a model. She was proof that their defiance could be visible, even celebrated. At the turn of the millennium, Omahyra Mota was everywhere. From the backstage chaos of Paris to the editorial shoots in New York lofts, her image was inescapable. Photographers loved the way her angles clashed with the softness of couture fabrics. Designers adored her ability to transform clothing into a manifesto. In an industry built on imitation, she was pure originality. Yet with that rise came whispers. Some insiders called her too abrasive, too niche, too radical. But for the youth who lived in leather jackets and listened to punk in dingy basements, she was the one who finally made fashion feel like theirs. Omahyra was the model who didn't smile politely. She sneered. She dared the industry to kick her out, and for a while, it couldn't. In the early 2000s, it seemed impossible to imagine a fashion world without her. She was not just walking the runway, she was rewriting it. Every step was a declaration beauty could be shaved, pierced, scarred, unpolished, and still undeniable. Omahyra Mota was not fitting into the narrative of fashion, she was writing a new one. But in fashion, even the boldest flames can be extinguished, not with scandal or noise, but with something far more brutal: silence. As Omahyra Mota's presence defined the early 2000s, something strange began to happen. By the time the industry started embracing terms like body positivity, gender fluidity, and non-conforming beauty, the very woman who had embodied all those ideals years before hashtags made them profitable was no longer in the room. She hadn't faded, she had been removed. No announcements, no fall from grace, no final runway, just disappearance. Her absence was deafening. When androgyny became fashionable, Omahyra was no longer on the runway. When the world began celebrating models with shaved heads and ambiguous looks, her name wasn't on the mood boards. When fashion magazines published glossy spreads featuring revolutionary new faces with bold features and fluid identities, Omahyra's image was nowhere to be found. It was as if the industry had decided she was too real to fit into its new performance of progress. Because Omahyra hadn't been a curated moment for a marketing campaign. She was the uncomfortable truth that had once forced fashion to look at itself differently. But now, with queer aesthetics commodified and difference turned into a trend, her authenticity was inconvenient. Designers began casting younger models who echoed her look, but softer, more malleable, more controllable. The aesthetic she had embodied was being recycled, watered down, and sold back to the public with fresher faces and newer hashtags. And through it all, the original blueprint was left uncredited. No tribute was written, no retrospective came. And this wasn't a case of public scandal or personal fall down. Omahyra hadn't disappeared because of addiction, legal trouble, or tabloid drama. She had simply stopped being marketable. What the industry once hailed as groundbreaking had become a liability the moment it could be repackaged into something more digestible. Omahyra's resistance to conform, once celebrated, was now seen as a brand risk. The same industry that had once begged her to walk its most prestigious runways now closed its doors without a word. This was not failure, this was erasure. There's something especially cool about being ahead of your time. When your existence writes the script, others will follow, but your name is left left out of the credits. Omahyra had walked so others could run, and those others didn't even know her name. To the new generation of models who celebrated gender expression and fluid beauty, Omahyra should have been a legend, a North Star. But without the industry's acknowledgement, her legacy remained buried under a decade of silence. Occasionally, a vintage editorial would resurface. A fan would post a tribute online. A fashion blog might reference her as that one model from the Gaultier shows. But these were flickers in the dark, not spotlights. And as for Omahyra herself, she didn't plead for relevance, she didn't chase interviews, she didn't issue a memoir or launch a brand. She watched the world finally arrive at the place she had once stood alone and let it pass by. Some called it pride, others called it disappearance. But perhaps it was something else entirely. A refusal to participate in a system that only values pioneers when their time has already passed. She didn't write a tell-all. She didn't stage a comeback runway. She didn't demand recognition from an industry that had already turned the page. Omahyra Mota did something far more radical. She kept living on her own terms. After stepping away from fashion's main stage, Omahyra slipped into other forms of expression. She appeared in a few films, including X-Men: The Last Stand, playing the role of Arclight, a mutant, fittingly. On screen, she was powerful, silent, and visually unforgettable, just like she had always been. But this wasn't a reinvention. It was a continuation of her quiet resistance to being defined by others. She moved between projects, sometimes acting, sometimes modeling for underground designers, sometimes just disappearing entirely. No explanations, no curated narratives. In an age where even rebellion is packaged for content, Omahyra's absence became a new kind of presence. She refused to let the system use her again as a comeback story, a forgotten legend, or a token in fashion's diversity parade. She had played that game once. She wasn't interested in replaying it. And yet, her legacy whispered through the edges of culture. Stylists referenced her without realizing it. Young models mimicked her poses without knowing where they came from. Editorials recycled her energy, her angles, her attitude, but never her name. For those who looked closely, though, she was still there. In every shaved head that walked into a casting unapologetically, in every model who defied gendered styling, in every runway that dared to look a little uncomfortable, Omahyra had planted the seeds. The world was finally harvesting them. But unlike many who crave credit, Omahyra seemed content to let her impact live through echoes. Her silence was not resignation, it was refusal. A refusal to dilute her truth just to fit back into a system that once deemed her too much. In the end, her redemption wasn't about being accepted. It was never needing acceptance to begin with. In the age of curated chaos and branded rebellion, Omahyra Mota remained something rare, the original. She didn't pose as a revolutionary, she was one. Not for a campaign, not for a trend, but because she existed, unapologetically, in a body and spirit the world didn't yet know how to categorize. Today, fashion celebrates what it once rejected. Genderless fashion lines dominate runways. Models with shaved heads and inked skin grace every major campaign. Androgyny is not only accepted, it's marketable. But somewhere in that glossy revolution, the name Omahyra Mota is often missing. She is the ghost in the frame, the silhouette behind every bold casting, the blueprint no one credits, the rupture that allowed others to enter more gently. But make no mistake, she didn't just walk before them, she kicked the damn door open. And while fashion continues to evolve, borrowing pieces of her legacy without acknowledgement, those who know, know. They know that before the buzzwords and the hashtags, there was a girl from Washington Heights who didn't ask to be seen, she demanded it. Her face made fashion uncomfortable, and it still should.